Chapter 411 Stuffing Herbs Like No Tomorrow. Both Nixon and Gilbert were enticed by the century-old saffron within Caspian's hands. Its value as a medicinal herb was incomparable. However much enticed they were, the both of them remained silent. "What's wrong? Are you both scared?" "I can't believe that the head elder of the Team AA and the 10th elder of Shadowgate are both too scared to make a bet with me," said Caspian disdainfully as he dramatically shook his head. Nixon and Gilbert then looked at each other for a moment before Nixon stepped forward. "In that case, Caspian, we'll make a bet with you." Gilbert nodded his head with satisfaction. He surmised that if he joined forces with Nixon, they would at least be able to fight Caspian to a tie. Both of them had to put on a show for their subordinates behind them, or they might lose their respect. Caspian's offer had given them no choice but to accept the bet. "Very well," Caspian nodded. "Although I wonder, what is it are you wagering against me? If you can't present something that matches my saffron in value, then forget it." Now that Caspian had presented the century-old saffron, the two of them had to put up something similar in value. Nixon gritted his teeth as he brought out a century-old shining cranesbill. "This herb that's as ancient as your saffron will be enough of a match." He had sacrificed hundreds of his subordinates for this herb alone. He had also consumed a part of it to heal his injuries. Nixon had planned to consume the entire herb when he returned to safety to enhance his powers a little. But Caspian was now forcing him to bring it out as a wager. Caspian nodded and replied, "It's missing a piece, but it's similar enough in value." The crowd then turned their attention to Gilbert. Gilbert didn't try to pull any tricks and presented a century-old lily of the valley. "My herb is of similar rarity and value to each of yours," explained Gilbert. It was the best thing he could bring to the table. "Now that our bet is set, let us begin," declared Caspian as he threw his saffron toward the peak of the stone stairway. Both Nixon and Gilbert then followed suit with their own prizes. The first to reach the peak of the Stairway to Enlightenment would be able to obtain all three prizes at once. Thousands of expert martial artists were drooling at the sight of the three treasures pooled atop the stone stairway. But it would be impossible for them to obtain. Caspian, Gilbert, and Nixon became the center of attention. Caspian whispered to Xandros as he passed by him, "I hope you're right about this, Mr. Stewart Sr., or else I'm going to lose a lot." The reason why Caspian dared to make the bet was because Xandros had told him about a trick to secure victory. "Relax. Just do as I said and you won't have a problem," replied Xandros confidently. Caspian could only believe in Xandros' words. So long as he could traverse the Stairway to Enlightenment, the Eldorian scroll fragment would be his. Caspian arrived in front of the stone stairway and turned to face Nixon and Gilbert. "Let's begin." The two of them nodded their heads in agreement. Three of them instantly disappeared from their spot, and their figures could be seen climbing up the stone stairway. "Go, Caspian, go. Do your best, Mr. Lynch." Sylvia, Aster, and the rest began cheering for Caspian as they began their race. Shadowgate members were also cheering for Gilbert, while the TMAA's men cheered for their head elder. The shouts of encouragement filled the entire valley. Meanwhile, other unaffiliated expert martial artists remained silent as they stared intently at the race happening on the Stairway to Enlightenment. The current ongoing race had nothing to do with them. Whoever won the race would secure the Eldorian scroll fragment for himself. For these men, their only goal was to fight for the scroll fragment once it finally appeared. The ongoing race atop the stone stairways was intense. Caspian was in the lead as he was the strongest among the three. Gilbert was following behind him, and the injured Nixon was last. Both Nixon and Gilbert began to panic as they watched Caspian move ahead of them. The Stairway to Enlightenment consisted of exactly 101 steps, and when all three of them reached the halfway point, their speed significantly dropped. They could feel an immense pressure emanating from the peak that weighed down on their bodies. Caspian maintained his speed even though he started panting for air. The Stairway to Enlightenment was mysterious. Indeed, it would have been impossible for Caspian to make it this far if not for his superior physique. Fortunately for him, Caspian had only used up 50% of his strength at this point. Gilbert and Nixon, however, weren't so lucky. Both of them found it difficult to scale the stone stairway, and Caspian had now expanded his lead by at least 10 steps. The both of them had thought they would have been on par with Caspian's strength, or at the very least, they wouldn't be too far behind. If they knew that Caspian had only used 50% of his power, They would be scared out of their wits. Gilbert had already used 90% of his power to barely keep up. Nixon, at the back, had already used up all his strength as his legs began to tremble. At this pace, he would be the first to drop out of the race. He was unwilling to be the first to drop out as he would become the subject of ridicule for all the spectators. Nixon gritted his teeth and pulled out some herbs from his pocket. He stuffed them into his mouth. He had wanted to save them for later, along with his treasured crane's-bill, but he had no other choice at this moment. He had to consume them now, or he would be out of the race. Nixon felt a current of warmth flow through his entire body after consuming the herbs. He took a few deep breaths as his body gradually regained its strength. Ha ha ha. Sylvia laughed out loud at both the TMAA and Shadowgate with contempt. So they're the elders of the TMAA and Shadowgate? They look so pitiful. Caspian will definitely be the first to reach the top. Horace and Fabian gritted their teeth with anger after hearing Sylvia's provocative comment. To their dismay, Sylvia was simply stating the truth. Caspian remained in the lead, while Nixon and Gilbert had noticeably slowed down. Xandros smiled as he watched the race unfold. Caspian's strength had exceeded his expectations. He realized that Caspian would have been able to win the race even without employing the tricks he had told him. Xandros marveled at the fact that Caspian was only in his 20s, and that he would still have a bright future ahead of him. Caspian continued his journey upward, and reached the 80th step. He began to slow down at this point as every step was becoming heavier and heavier. Caspian had already used 70% of his power. He felt as if he was carrying a huge mountain on his back. An ordinary person would have their bones crushed from the immense pressure alone. Meanwhile, Nixon was far behind the other two. Gilbert gritted his teeth as he carried on upward, but he was also visibly reaching his limit. He didn't want to lose just like this either. He stuffed some herbs into his mouth without any hesitation. The distance between Gilbert and Caspian was a dozen steps away. Gilbert felt a tinge of despair bubbling in his heart. Just how powerful was Caspian to be able to go on? The next moment, Caspian turned around to look at Gilbert and smiled at him deviously. Chapter 412 Weaklings. Caspian waved his little finger at Gilbert. Gilbert's face turned red with anger as Caspian was clearly insulting him. You! The sudden surge of anger caused Gilbert to spit out a mouthful of blood. Caspian shook his head as he realized that Gilbert was weaker than he expected. Gilbert angrily stared up at Caspian. I'm going to find a way to kill you, Caspian. Suddenly, a miserable scream came from below. Nixon had knelt down on the stone steps as his legs could no longer go on. The immense pressure emanating from the peak prevented him from standing up. He felt that his bones were on the verge of being crushed by the immense pressure. Caspian shook his head as he watched his two competitors lose their pair Gilbert's side before continuing to move upward. Thousands of expert martial artists were flabbergasted by the sight. The TMAA's head elder was so overwhelmed that he had knelt down on his knees. The men from the TMAA began to panic. Impossible! The head elder must be just joking with us. That's right, he can't possibly lose. Everyone looked at Nixon with disbelief. Nixon felt more ashamed than ever as he faced the fact that he was the weakest among the three of them. He had become a joke in everyone's eyes the moment he knelt down. Nixon couldn't afford to lose the race. But the truth was that losing the Shining Crane's bill was nothing compared to failing his mission to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Nixon brought out all of the herbs he had left and stuffed everything into his mouth in one go. He slowly stood back up as his strength gradually recovered. Caspian didn't want to waste any more time on the two of them, and continued his way up the stone stairway. This is so sad to watch. So this is the head elder of the TMAA? He just straight up knelt down on the floor. And now he's munching on grass again. I would have just quietly surrendered if I were him. Sylvia resumed mocking the TMAA. The people from the TMAA wanted to retort her comments, but they couldn't manage to come up with a reply. What a feeble old man! Exclaimed Sylvia with contempt. The people from the TMAA turned gloomy as Sylvia continued to mock their head elder. Horace finally had enough and stepped up. Who the fuck do you think you are, Sylvia? You don't have the right to say anything about us. I'm gonna do it anyway. So what? Replied Sylvia. Bastard! I can't stand this bitch anymore. We need to teach her a lesson, shouted Horace. Kill her! 3,000 people from the TMAA roared out in unison. They had never been humiliated to this extent before. "A bunch of losers," exclaimed Sylvia. The TMAA was indeed a powerful organization in the eyes of the public. But they were nothing but scraps in the eyes of Sylvia. The people from the TMAA believed that they were invincible just because they could fare better than ordinary citizens. But if they were to join actual battlefields, they would wet their pants from fear. Sylvia waved her hand, and hundreds of armored soldiers stepped forward. The two forces faced off against each other in anticipation of a battle. Horace, however, was already hiding behind his own men without anyone noticing. "Horace, you fucking idiot!" Nixon was furious as he realized that Horace and Sylvia were about to fight. Starting a fight with Sylvia at this point was nothing but suicide. They had already lost too many of their men. They would lose all chances at retrieving the Eldorian scroll fragment if they lost them all. But the distance was simply too far apart for Horace to hear what Nixon was saying. Nixon looked up to find Caspian and Gilbert still making their way up to the stone stairway. He gritted his teeth as he continued to follow them. He had to stick it out until the very end. The next moment, Sylvia's and Horace's men began to fight each other. Caspian kept up with a steady pace and was 8 steps away from the peak. Even he had begun to feel tired. He looked back at Gilbert to find him trembling, while his entire body was covered in sweat. He then looked farther back to find Nixon climbing upward with both his hands and feet. Caspian smiled at the both of them. "Why so slow? You too? You're like turtles." They were furious, but they couldn't refute his claims. They wondered just how large of a gap there was between Caspian and themselves as they realized he still seemed relatively at ease. "Nice try, Caspian. I can tell that you're also at your limits," shouted Gilbert. Gilbert didn't believe that Caspian was truly that powerful. Nixon added, "That's right, Caspian. You can stop pretending now. I don't believe you still have the strength to keep going." Both Nixon and Gilbert assumed that Caspian was similarly at his limit, as they felt like they were already carrying a huge mountain on their backs. Caspian suddenly laughed out loud. "Both of you are really narrow-minded." He then took a deep breath and utilized his entire body's strength to continue upward. The two of them were shocked beyond relief as they watched him continue moving up. They could only wonder if Caspian had already used all of his strength or not. Meanwhile, the battle happening below was similarly tragic. Hundreds of the TMAA's people had collapsed on the floor. The TMAA had already lost 800 of their fighters in less than 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Sylvia's forces suffered only minor injuries. The TMAA's forces froze up from fear as Sylvia and the armored battalion under her lead seemed like demons to them. Sylvia looked at Horace and asked, "Would you like to continue?" Horace didn't dare to utter another word as he was afraid that Sylvia would kill him. The entire TMAA's forces might get wiped out if he continued to fight, and it would also similarly result in his own death. Chickening out already? Might as well just disband the entire TMAA while you're at it. "Losers!" shouted Sylvia. The TMAA's men were depressed as they listened to her provocation. They were furious, but not one of them dared to fight back. "I'm too busy to argue with you," said Horace as he turned away. Sylvia suddenly lost interest in the TMAA after she watched Horace admit defeat, even though she could have taken this opportunity to severely weaken the TMAA. Both Fabian and Charles were shocked by Sylvia and the armored battalion's might as they looked at each other. Someone suddenly shouted, "Everyone, look, Caspian's about to reach the top." Everyone's attention was once again brought toward Caspian. Caspian was only 3 steps away from reaching the top, while Gilbert and Nixon were 10 steps and 16 steps away respectively. "What's wrong? Head Elder, should I sponsor you some more herbs?" taunted Caspian. "I don't need your help," said Nixon through clenched teeth. He couldn't bear it any longer as Caspian kept insulting him. "Climb at your own pace. You two. I'm done playing with you both," said Caspian as he turned away. He finally made the last step and reached the top of the stairway to Enlightenment. Both Gilbert and Nixon were panicking as they watched the scene unfold before them. Chapter 413, Blood-Stained Stairway to Enlightenment. Nixon and Gilbert couldn't catch up to Caspian at all. Caspian stood still at the peak with his body completely drenched in sweat. He felt as if he had just been baptized by his own sweat, blood, and tears. Climbing up the stairway to Enlightenment was akin to going through a difficult test. Only the man standing at its peak could be declared the strongest. At the same time, the immense pressure was finally lifted from Caspian's body. Caspian seemed like a king as he proudly looked at the crowd below from the top. Impossible! How could he possibly reach the top before us? Both Gilbert and Nixon were agonizing over their loss. They had lost to Caspian, despite using all their might. The two of them were seething with anger. "Seems like I'm the winner," said Caspian, as he picked up all 3 valuable herbs off the floor. Both Nixon and Gilbert were so furious by the outcome that they collectively spat out a mouthful of blood. They both considered themselves strong, and yet they both lost to Caspian fair and square. The humiliation Caspian dealt them finally pushed them past the edge. "Listen to me, my team and double of brothers. Kill them all. Shadowgate, attack." Both Nixon and Gilbert issued their commands at once. The abnormal pressure emanating from the Stairway to Enlightenment gradually died down ever since Caspian reached the peak. Both of them took the opportunity to claw up to the peak. "Protect Caspian! He's finally reached the top!" shouted Sylvia. Hundreds of armored soldiers rushed over to clash against their enemies. "Shit! Caspian's men are coming. We gotta hurry up or Kaplan's going to get his hands on the Eldorian scroll fragment." Everyone sprung into action as Sylvia and the armored battalion began their move. Caspian looked down at the crowd below from the peak, and it reminded him of ants going to war. The enemy forces were truly mere ants that didn't require his attention. "Kill them all! My armored battalion!" ordered Caspian. "Kill them!" roared his armored soldiers as they charged into battle without any hesitation. The Stairway to Enlightenment was soon painted red with blood, resembling a hellscape as corpses littered the floor. Gilbert and Nixon felt as if their hearts were stabbed by daggers as they could only watch their subordinates get massacred without any chance of fighting back. The only thing they could do now was to reach the top and snatch the Eldorian scroll fragment from Caspian. Every sacrifice until this point would be worth it so long as they could obtain the scroll fragment. The battle was completely one-sided, as the armored battalion was nearly invincible. "Hurry and get up here! Sylvia!" shouted Caspian. "So long, losers!" Sylvia waved at Horace and his men before rushing up the stone stairway. 30 minutes later, Sylvia and her men finally reached the top as well. The pressure emanating from the stone stairway had mostly dissipated. But even then, everyone still spent a lot of their strength to make the climb. Xandros, however, seemed to be at ease after the climb compared to the others. He didn't resemble the 100-year-old senior that he was. Caspian waved his hands and said, "Mr. Stewart Sr., let's go in already." Now that the Eldorian scroll fragment was just one step away, he wanted to secure it before thinking about anything else. As for Nixon, Gilbert, and their men, he could always deal with them later. Both of them let out a sigh of relief as they watched Caspian lead the charge into the tomb. Although they wanted to go in as well, they had no choice but to wait for reinforcements to arrive. It would be a futile effort if they went inside alone. Around an hour later, Fabian, Horace, and the rest of the fighters finally reached the peak. All of them were drenched in sweat. They had already used up all their energy. "A bunch of losers," said Nixon. He realized his own subordinates were truly useless. The Team AA currently had only 1,000 men left, while Shadowgate had only around 500 remaining. They had been through heavy losses by the time they reached the peak. Horace stepped up to Nixon and asked, "Head Elder, are you okay?" Nixon immediately slapped him and scolded, "You bastard! Who told you to fight Caspian's men?" Nixon had brought 5,000 men with him when he departed from Dord City, and now 1,000 was all that was left. He felt extremely bad about the unjustified losses. Horace remained quiet as he held onto his burning cheek. He could tell that Nixon may just kill him right then and there if he tried to say anything. Nixon snorted at him and felt much better after looking at his miserable face. "Mr. Shane, what should we do now? We've already lost too many of our men. I don't think we can survive going into the tomb," asked Nixon. Gilbert realized what Nixon was implying right away. They would need to join forces and deal with their common enemy if they wanted to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment. Gilbert suddenly laughed out loud as he turned to face the thousands of unaffiliated expert martial artists. They had similarly arrived at the peak of the Stairway to Enlightenment, with no energy left to spare while drenched in sweat. They trembled at the sight of Gilbert laughing maliciously. "Surrender all your resources to us," declared Gilbert. The unaffiliated expert martial artists were left dumbfounded. "What? You can't do this to us." They couldn't believe that the TMAA and Shadowgate would stoop so low as to rob them of their herbs after they had finished their own. "Surrender your herbs willingly, and you may still have a chance to live," declared Nixon. "Fuck, who do they think we are? Their treasure vault. We won't just do as you say. Come, my friends, we'll show them who's boss." The unaffiliated expert martial artists had disliked both the TMAA and Shadowgate since the very start for acting like they were better fighters just because they had an organization to align with. The rest of the unaffiliated fighters weren't pushovers either, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. They deemed it necessary to fight against the TMAA and Shadowgate, as they couldn't afford to lose their supply of herbs if they wanted to finish the journey. The next moment, another battle broke out on the stone stairway as blood-curdling screams rose and fell. The unaffiliated expert martial artists never stood a chance against both the TMAA and Shadowgate. The stone stairway was painted red within 10 minutes as hundreds of bodies lay across the floor. The remaining 1,000 unaffiliated expert martial artists had all frozen up from fear. They decided to surrender and willingly gave away the herbs they had brought along. They didn't dare to continue the fight as the TMAA and Shadowgate's forces would stop at nothing in order to secure their goal. The weak should fear the strong. After all, the unaffiliated expert martial artists didn't want to die just like this after all they had gone through to attain their current strength. Gilbert and Nixon nodded their heads with satisfaction as they brought their men inside the tomb. The remaining men who had been robbed clean followed behind the group and entered the tomb as well. They had no other option but to proceed now that they had already come so far. The stairway to enlightenment soon fell silent, with only corpses decorating the stairways. Suddenly, a huge crowd appeared before the stone stairway. Chapter 414, The Stone Coffin. Dozens of silhouettes gathered in front of the stairway to enlightenment. The person leading the charge was none other than the Ice Queen herself, Jin. Farther back were some members of the Morrison family. They didn't run into any further trouble as the path in front of them had already been paved with blood. The Morrison family didn't join hands with anyone and remained on their own. There were pros and cons to their decision, but they hadn't gotten a single casualty ever since they arrived. Sitting back and swooping in to reap the rewards once their competitors were tired had always been the Morrison family's style. As for Jin herself, no one could tell what she was thinking. Her eyes seemed like an emotionless void. It would only light up with affection whenever she caught Caspian in her sights. The Morrisons frowned as they looked at the densely packed corpses lining the stone stairway. Fresh blood was still dripping from the bodies as they flowed down the stairs like a river. The crowd couldn't help but shudder as they looked at the aftermath. "Miss Morrison, it would seem that the TMAA and Shadowgate have suffered heavy losses. Most of the corpses belong to the TMAA and Shadowgate, while some are third-party forces. None of the bodies here include Caspian's men." The men working for Jin could still gauge the situation with one simple glance. The Morrisons were shocked as they wondered if Caspian's subordinates were blessed with divine protection to have suffered zero casualties. They could only wonder just how powerful Caspian was to have such achievements in his 20s. Jin remained unfazed, as if she had already expected such an outcome. Losers like Gilbert and Nixon couldn't stand a chance against her one and only. "Ms. Morrison, should we chase after them?" asked Ginger. "Of course," replied Jin as she rushed ahead of her group. Meanwhile, the final stone gate within the tomb had just opened. Caspian and his men finally arrived at the grave of the Stuart's ancestors. Both sides of the wall within the tomb were decorated with luminous gemstones that illuminated the entire tomb. Within the center of the room was a huge coffin made of stone. It was the final resting place of one of the Stuart family's ancestors. Xandros immediately knelt down before the coffin and started crying. "Forgive me, my ancestors. I allowed so many people with ill intentions to disrupt your rest. Please stand up, Mr. Stewart Sr. This isn't your fault. I'm sure your ancestors had also anticipated such a day to come," consoled Caspian. Xandros wiped his tears and stood up. "You're right, Caspian. We should move on and retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment immediately." "Just where is the Eldorian scroll fragment hidden within this tomb, Mr. Stewart Sr.?" asked Caspian. Xandros pointed at the coffin and explained, "It's inside the stone coffin." His expression suddenly sank as he explained that one would have to open up the coffin to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment. "Will there be traps?" asked Caspian. "Of course. Xandros was interrupted by the arrival of Gilbert, Nixon, and their men. "You bastards! You actually followed me here!" shouted Caspian. The crowd didn't even care to listen to what Caspian was saying. They were fixated on the stone coffin in the center of the tomb. The Eldorian scroll fragment should be right there. Absolutely. Everyone looked at the coffin with anticipation, as the Eldorian scroll fragment's allure was just too great. "Ha ha ha. The Eldorian scroll fragment will be mine. Fuck off, maybe in your dreams." Hundreds of expert martial artists stepped up and rushed toward the stone coffin without any hesitation when even the people from the TMAA and Shadowgate were standing still obediently. Both Gilbert and Nixon snorted at the sight of the men rushing toward certain death. And sure enough, something happened right as the men approached the coffin. A cold flash of steel temporarily lit up the room as arrows burst out of the walls from all four directions. The next moment, blood-curdling screams rang out within the tomb. Hundreds of bodies all fell down beside the coffin in an instant. Everyone who remained still had already guessed that there would be a trap, but they never expected it to be so deadly. Among the corpses included even eternal grandmasters. They were felled by the arrows. Caspian whispered, "It would seem that retrieving the Eldorian scroll fragment won't be as easy as I thought, Mr. Stewart Sr." Xandros narrowed his eyes along with a smile. "Don't worry. When the time is right, the scroll fragment will naturally be yours." Caspian didn't ask any more questions after hearing his explanation. Both Nixon's and Gilbert's expressions also sank as they realized Caspian seemed relaxed while standing in place. The two of them wanted the Eldorian scroll fragment just as much as anyone else, but they had no idea just how many more traps were laid around the coffin. It could potentially be fatal if they rushed toward the coffin while assuming that the coast was clear. They then turned to Xandros and Nixon. "Hey you, old man, I'm sure you know how to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment. Tell us already. Have some respect for your elders, please. Besides, I won't tell you anything even if I do know something," replied Xandros. Nixon was boiling with anger. "You!" He had already suffered enough humiliation from Caspian, yet he was now being disrespected by some feeble old man. "You already have one foot in the grave anyway, old man. Why don't I help you with the other foot as well?" shouted Nixon as he rushed towards Xandros. Caspian didn't intend to block the hit for Xandros at all. He had always suspected that Xandros was powerful. Caspian was confident that he could fend for himself. The next moment, Nixon was sent flying backward as he spat out a mouthful of blood. How is this possible? 100-year-old man sent the head elder flying? The crowd was flabbergasted as they stared at Xandros. Someone suddenly cried out, "He's a Supreme Grandmaster!" Xandros had to be a Supreme Grandmaster to be able to send Nixon flying with just a single punch. Nixon looked up at Xandros in disbelief at the fact that a 100-year-old man like him had such power. 8 extreme fist. Nixon went from surprised to terrified as he realized the 100-year-old man before him knew 8 extreme fists. He had assumed that Xandros was just some senior citizen. He never anticipated the possibility that Xandros was such a powerful fighter who managed to completely conceal his power. The crowd fell silent as they watched the scene unfold. Gilbert, too, had become wary of Xandros and didn't dare to act rashly. The Eldorian scroll fragment was just within an arm's reach, but no one had dared to make a move. Gilbert soon stepped up and explained, "What's the point of wasting time, Caspian? It's only fair if we all make a move together. I don't mind. Why don't you have a shot at the scroll fragment first? If you can manage to retrieve it, it's yours to keep," replied Caspian with a sly grin. "In your dreams," shouted Gilbert. Gilbert could tell that Caspian was trying to have Shadowgate scout the way ahead for him. "I have all the time in the world to wait for you to make a move," explained Caspian. Caspian was also able to tell what his enemies were planning. He wasn't worried about having a standoff, while Gilbert and Nixon began to panic. They couldn't afford to idle any longer. "Nixon!" shouted Gilbert. Both of them were exhausted, and the situation would only be worse the longer they dragged it out. Chapter 415 Poisonous Gas. Nixon looked up at Gilbert and calmly explained, "I'm down for joining forces. But I'm not so stupid that I can't tell you're just trying to have me scout the path ahead for you." The TMAA had lost too many of their fighters. Any more rash decisions could potentially turn Nixon into the sole survivor. Gilbert had no choice but to turn to face the remaining hundreds of unaffiliated expert martial artists. "You lot, charge in now! shouted Gilbert. The unaffiliated expert martial artists were furious, but they were also unable to retort his orders. They had arrived in tens of thousands, and all that remained of them now was mere hundreds. Charging in at this point would spell the end for all of them. "What's this? Are you disobeying me?" asked Gilbert. The only reason he spared them during the fight earlier was to use them to scout the way for him. Sacrifices had to be made now that the Eldorian scroll fragment was close at hand. Both the people of the TMAA and Shadowgate stepped forward to face the unaffiliated expert martial artists. Just as Gilbert finished his, the unaffiliated expert martial artists had no other choice but to obey, for they would also meet certain death otherwise. They wailed out in despair. They had come looking for the Eldorian scroll fragment, only to be used as explorers into unknown traps. Caspian, however, didn't feel a shred of pity for them. Everyone who made it here was doing this out of greed. He would have dealt with them one way or another, even if Gilbert never attempted to threaten them. "Let's go. We'll fight till the end." The unaffiliated expert martial artists had no other choice but to charge headfirst into the unknown with the expectation of certain death. They might still have a chance to survive if they ventured forward, while staying still would only end up getting them killed by the TMAA and Shadowgate. Another volley of arrows shot out from the walls as the men rushed toward the coffin. They never stood a chance to begin with. "Fuck you, TMAA. Fuck you, Shadowgate. You bastards. I'll haunt you for the rest of your lives." Fucking hell, these people are heartless. I don't want to die. It hurts. Blood-curdling screams rang out within the tomb once more. None made it out alive as they joined the corpses on the floor. Both Nixon and Gilbert remained calm as ever as they saw the men they had forced into the trap as nothing but fodders. They pitied their efforts for trying to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment when they were so weak. The weak should fear the strong. That was simply the rule. The weaker martial artists had no say in the matter and ended up in a pool of blood on the floor. The tomb seemingly became hell on earth as the entire area around the coffin was flowing with blood. Caspian lamented at the terrible sight as he reassured himself with the task of obtaining the Eldorian scroll fragment. Be it the TMAA or Shadowgate, so long as they were a danger to the citizens of Diatoran, he would eradicate them without mercy. Gilbert snorted. "Bunch of losers!" He was disappointed with how weak the men he had sent into the trap were. Shadowgate would employ all sorts of tricks to achieve their goal. Sacrificing some insignificant people was an acceptable action so long as he could retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment. Gilbert felt that it was unfortunate that they never managed to open the coffin before they died. "Fabian, bring 50 men with you and open the coffin," ordered Gilbert. Fabian nodded his head without a choice. "Yes, sir." He had already surrendered his life to Shadowgate the moment he joined them as an official member. He had to obey Gilbert's every whim, or he would end up with a fate worse than death. Fabian proceeded to carry out the order and charged forward with 50 other Shadowgate members. They approached the coffin and found it difficult to even stand still due to all the corpses littering the floor. The accompanying smell of blood made them feel nauseous. These men had long been accustomed to death, but they couldn't help but be disgusted at the gruesome sight before them. Fabian led the charge as he carefully stepped forward. No more traps sprung up, and they finally reached the coffin itself. Gilbert held his breath in anticipation as any more traps would kill off Fabian along with his men. Their bodies would make it difficult to open up the coffin. "Open it up," ordered Fabian. Dozens of Shadowgate members were getting ready to push the coffin open. At the same time, Fabian stealthily took a few steps back. He was similarly afraid of death, just like everyone else. The stone coffin was gradually pushed open with the combined effort of the dozens of Shadowgate members. Everyone looked over with anticipation. Caspian also began to panic. Mr. Stewart Sr. Xandros reassured him, saying, "Relax, getting the Eldorian scroll fragment wouldn't be so easy." Caspian was convinced as he knew that Xandros wouldn't play around with his ancestors. The coffin was finally pushed open. Everyone present would go into a frenzy once they could confirm that the Eldorian scroll fragment had appeared. The coffin's lid was thrown aside, and it crashed directly to the floor. "Charge! I'll reward whoever gets the scroll fragment with $500 million. The people of the Team Double A instantly rushed toward the coffin. "Secure the Eldorian scroll fragment first," shouted Nixon. "Protect Fabian at all costs." Gilbert was also about to make a move. Nixon took a step forward and blocked his way. "Where are you going, Mr. Shane?" Their cooperation ended the moment the Eldorian scroll fragment appeared. Gilbert's expression sank as he looked at Nixon. "Nixon, do you wish to die?" He never saw Nixon as anything but a competitor. The only victor in this race was the one that acquired the Eldorian scroll fragment. And Gilbert wouldn't let anything hold him back. Suddenly, dark green-colored smoke rose up from within the coffin. Dozens of Shadowgate's members were covered by the strange smoke in an instant. "Arg! My eyes! My face hurts! Save me! Save me, please!" They began to cry out for help as they screamed in pain. The dark green-colored smoke contained lethal poison that would melt the skin off of anyone who came into contact with it. The affected Shadowgate men clawed all over their bodies as if trying to scratch off an itch. They would eventually tear bloody chunks of flesh off their own faces. The crowd watched in horror as these people resembled demons from hell. The poisoned men took off their masks, revealing their faces. Every single one of them had hideous faces filled with scars. Fabian was startled by the scene unfolding before him and hurriedly backed away. If he were a second slower, he would have succumbed to the same fate as well. Blood-curdling screams rose and fell as they echoed throughout the entire tomb. Dozens of Shadowgate men eventually collapsed onto the floor. The skin on their body had already melted off. The people of the TMAA and Shadowgate, who were about to rush toward the coffin, had all frozen up in fear. What the hell happened? Gilbert felt immense guilt as he watched his own men die in such a horrifying way. The tomb was filled with traps upon traps that took everyone by surprise. Fabian knelt down before Gilbert and pleaded, "I'm sorry I failed, Mr. Shane." He would have also perished if he hadn't selfishly taken a few steps back in preparation when the coffin was being opened. Dozens of Shadowgate members died in less than a minute from the tomb's traps. Fabian could only wonder how Gilbert would punish him for his incompetence. Chapter 416, Eldorian Scroll Fragment Retrieved. Fabian felt unprecedented danger creeping up his back as he became drenched in his own sweat. Gilbert, however, immediately calmed down. "Forget it, I won't blame you for something no one expected." Killing Fabian now would just be throwing away resources for no good reason and rendering himself alone. Fabian politely expressed his gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Shane." Horace and his men, who were about to rush over to the coffin, immediately halted their steps. They were both horrified by the gruesome deaths and thankful that they were slower. They would have joined the Shadowgate members in a painful death otherwise. Everyone present felt a chill down their spine as they watched the skin on the perished Shadowgate men decay at a rapid pace. Nobody knew if there were more traps to come from within the coffin itself. Nixon turned to Caspian and shouted, "Caspian!" Gilbert was furious as well. "I'll kill you once you retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment, Caspian." Caspian had been standing still at the side, while everyone tried to get their hands on the scroll fragment. It was obvious that Caspian knew about the traps hiding within the coffin. And yet, in the next moment, Caspian took a step forward and lunged toward the coffin. His speed caught everyone by surprise as they couldn't even react by the time he had reached the coffin. Everyone was confused as they wondered if Caspian had lost his mind to be diving headfirst into a trap. "Shit, we were tricked," shouted Gilbert. "That fucker! This means that there are no more traps left." "Get him," shouted Nixon. Caspian had Xandros guiding him throughout the tomb the entire time. The fact that he willingly approached the coffin was proof that it was now safe. Caspian reached the coffin in an instant. He found a corpse lying inside. It looked no different from a living but sleeping person. The body showed no signs of decay, and its skin remained plump with hints of blood flow. Caspian was startled by the sight. He had heard rumors that truly powerful individuals could reach a state where their deceased bodies wouldn't decay at all. He could only wonder just how powerful was the Stewart family's ancestor lying inside the coffin before him. Two scrolls that seemed to be made of sheepskin were placed on both sides of the corpse. Caspian wasn't certain about what the scrolls were made out of, but he knew for certain that they were the Eldorian scroll fragment and the 8 Extreme Fist manuscript. Either of these scrolls were to fall into the wrong hands. The consequences could shake up the entirety of Diatoran. Even the Diatoranian god of war was shocked by what he was seeing. No one else knew better than Caspian about the benefits one could acquire through an Eldorian scroll fragment. He had stumbled across one of the scroll fragments by chance and risen through the ranks from a mere soldier into the Diatoranian god of war himself. He became invincible and unmatched in combat as he led his troops to victory. He could only imagine how much more he could achieve now that he had his hands on another scroll fragment. Xandros shouted at the dumbfounded Caspian. "What are you gawking at, Caspian? Let's go!" Caspian finally snapped back to his senses as he retrieved both scrolls out of the coffin. "Fuck! We were tricked! Caspian got the scroll fragment!" Both Gilbert and Nixon were furious. "Go and snatch the scroll from him. We can't let Caspian get away with the Eldorian scroll fragment." Everyone rushed toward Caspian as they all wanted the Eldorian scroll fragment for themselves as well. "Put the scrolls down, Caspian, or you won't make it out of here alive," declared Gilbert. Caspian smiled as he stuffed both scrolls into his clothes. "Come and get them if you can. Kill him." Gilbert and his men furiously stared at Caspian as he put the scrolls away. They had been tricked by Caspian to scout the way ahead for him. Everyone readied their weapons and rushed toward Caspian. "Protect Caspian! Kill them all!" Sylvia waved her hand, and hundreds of armored soldiers rushed forward to meet the people of the TMAA in battle. Battle cries filled the tomb once more as the two forces clashed against each other. Both Gilbert and Nixon went directly after Caspian. "Give me the scrolls, Caspian!" They had sacrificed so much and came so far just for the Eldorian scroll fragment. They were furious that Caspian managed to get a hold of the treasure before they could. Caspian stood still with his arms crossed. "Show me what you got." Gilbert and Nixon were startled and subconsciously took a few steps back as Caspian emanated immense pressure. The two of them nodded at each other before lunging toward their target once more with all their remaining strength. Caspian smiled at the both of them. Useless! He launched two powerful blows, each of his fists aimed at Nixon's and Gilbert's faces respectively. The two of them saw the attack coming, but it was too late to dodge. Caspian never took on a stance before throwing his punches, but it was still a powerful attack that was shaped by his countless battle experiences. His plain fists alone held immense power. Caspian's fists grew larger and larger within Nixon's and Gilbert's field of vision. Two thuds could be heard as the punches finally connected to their targets. Both Gilbert and Nixon were sent flying backward while Caspian stood still in the same spot. The pressure emanating from Caspian was suffocating. Not even powerful fighters like Gilbert and Nixon could stand a chance against Caspian as their attack seemed powerless before him. How is this possible? Gilbert was dumbfounded as Caspian's punch had sent him flying 30 feet away. He had to use up all his strength to prevent himself from flying farther away. He subsequently coughed out a mouthful of blood. Gilbert couldn't believe that even after joining forces with Nixon, they still weren't a match for Caspian. Could Caspian truly be above even a supreme grandmaster? Gilbert was terrified by his own thoughts. The only man powerful enough to match a supreme grandmaster in strength within Shadowgate was Elijah himself. Nixon seemed even worse in comparison as he was already inferior to Gilbert in the first place. He couldn't withstand Caspian's punch due to all the injuries he had accumulated up to this point. He was sent flying all the way into the wall. Nixon turned pale white as he coughed out several mouthfuls of blood. He felt extremely weak, as if his internal organs had been shattered by Caspian's attack. He had completely lost any remaining strength to resume fighting. Nixon had mentally surrendered. He no longer felt fear or surprise. However, a deep weight of his own inferiority overwhelmed him. His only thought now was to escape from this place. It was too unrealistic to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment from the monster that was Caspian. Continuing to struggle would only end up with him being killed by Caspian himself. He could always escape and live to see another day instead of blindly burning away his remaining chance at life. Chapter 417. Do you want it? Horace appeared before Nixon and helped him up. "Head Elder, are you all right?" Nixon felt unprecedented warmth in his life as Horace held on to him. He had always treated Horace as someone disposable, but now, Horace was his only salvation. Nixon clenched his teeth and replied, "I'm fine. We need to retreat, or we're all going to die here." An ambiguous expression swept across Horace's face. He realized that the decision to retreat was because Nixon was seriously injured. A sly grin crept up on Horace's face, and it gradually turned into a wicked smile. The next moment, a dagger was stabbed into Nixon's abdomen. Nixon spat out another large mouthful of blood. "Horace, you." He looked at Horace in disbelief. He never expected Horace to backstab him at a time like this. Nixon clenched his teeth and asked, "Why are you doing this?" He couldn't understand why Horace would want to kill his own ally. Horace laughed and whispered, Heh, you had it a long time coming for treating me like shit when I'm also a senior of the Team AA like you. He had been waiting for a chance to enact his revenge for a long time. Now that he had finally done it, he was elated as he watched Nixon dying in his arms. He had fantasized about this exact moment for a very long time. Nixon cursed at him once more. Horace, you're only who you are today because I brought you back to the Team AA. The chairman will definitely kill you for backstabbing me. He could only blame himself for not realizing Horace's intentions sooner. It was too late for Nixon to even fight back. Horace laughed and replied, "The chairman won't know what happened here. Everyone will just assume that you died fighting Caspian. You can rest assured that I'll bring our men out of here as you intended." He then grabbed his dagger and twisted it across Nixon's body, slicing all of his internal organs into a gory mess. Nixon continued to spit out blood as his consciousness started to fade. "Horace, you bastard. I'll be haunting you for the rest of your life." Nixon finished his last words and finally collapsed onto the ground. Horace let out a sigh of relief after confirming that Nixon had indeed passed away. He would not be able to get away with this if Nixon somehow survived. "The head elder has died. Caspian killed him. We need to retreat," shouted Horace as he pretended to be distraught over the situation. "What? The head elder is killed?" The people of the TMAA were all shocked by the sudden news. Nixon Xandros, the head elder of the TMAA, was dead. Even Caspian was surprised by the announcement. He had indeed struck Nixon with a powerful blow, but he could tell that Nixon wouldn't have died from his one attack. Caspian took a closer look at Nixon's corpse and found a dagger embedded within the body. He quickly realized that Nixon had perished in the hands of Horace. Horace was truly evil to be backstabbing his own allies. And the worst thing that came out of this mess was that Caspian was labeled as the killer. He couldn't care less about it, as he never planned to let anyone get out of here alive. "The head elder is dead. We gotta retreat. We're all gonna die if we don't make a run for it now." Retreat? The people of the TMAA instantly lost their will to fight after hearing about Nixon's death. They realized that if even the head elder himself had perished, they would not fare any better if they stayed. The next moment, the people of the TMAA began to scatter and flee. "Do you really think you can get away? Attention! Armored battalion! Kill them all!" shouted Sylvia. The armored soldiers responded in unison, "Kill them all!" The people of the TMAA were slaughtered as they didn't even put up a fight. Gilbert was also left dumbfounded as he watched the scene unfold. He couldn't believe that Nixon died just like that. He began to wonder if he should also retreat. Now that the Eldorian scroll fragment had appeared right in front of him, retreating was a truly depressing option. Suddenly, dozens of silhouettes appeared within the tomb. They were all men working for the Morrison family. Everyone was also surprised as they saw some of the Morrisons appear before them. The Morrisons had also arrived to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment, and they were also an enemy to Caspian. And, of course, the enemy of an enemy was a friend. Caspian narrowed his eyes with intrigue as the Morrisons had finally shown themselves. He hadn't yet forgotten about Jin. He knew her well enough to know that she had an unusual approach to conflicts ever since their days working together in the military. If Jin were a male heir to the Morrison family, she would have surely been the patriarch. By Gilbert was delighted to find Jin appearing within the tomb. He had to join forces with another party in order to snatch the Eldorian scroll fragment away from Caspian. The Morrison family was a powerful force that he could very well use as an ally. Requesting to form an alliance with them right now would be the best option. "Miss Morrison, how about working together now that the Eldorian scroll fragment is in Caspian's hands?" shouted Gilbert. Jin remained expressionless as she seemed to completely ignore Gilbert's question. She wasn't convinced by the request of an alliance as she knew that Gilbert and his men combined couldn't even compare to a tenth of Caspian. They were never even considered a worthy opponent for Caspian. Meanwhile, Ginger was feeling anxious as she realized that the Eldorian scroll fragment was right there in Caspian's hands. Her mission, along with the rest of the Morrison family, was to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment through any means necessary. "Miss Morrison, why don't we team up with Shadowgate to deal with Caspian?" asked Ginger. Jin glanced at Ginger and replied, "Shut up! Who said you could speak?" Ginger's expression twisted with anger and disbelief as she was once again reprimanded by Jin because of Caspian. But all she could do was to listen and obey Jin. Noticing Jin's reluctance, Gilbert shouted, "Miss Morrison, what are you hesitating for? If we wait any longer, Caspian might get away with the scrolls. Jin threw a disdainful glance at Gilbert and replied, Shadow Gate isn't worthy enough to team up with us. The Morrison family was the most powerful family within Dord City, while Shadowgate was just some random organized group of hooligans. Cooperation between the two would only serve to lower the Morrison family's reputation. Gilbert's expression immediately sank. What do you mean by that? He didn't expect Jin to be so disrespectful. An even bigger surprise was that Jin approached Caspian casually as she stared at him while ignoring everyone's gaze. Everyone was confused as they watched Jin steadily approach Caspian one step at a time. No one knew what she was trying to do. Jin soon arrived right in front of Caspian. The two of them stared at each other and remained silent. 1 minute later, Caspian pulled out the Eldorian scroll fragment from his pockets and asked, Are you trying to take this from me as well? Will you give it to me if I say I want it? Asked Jin. She was looking forward to hearing what Caspian had to say. Jin was actually just hoping that Caspian still had feelings for her. When they were both still teammates in the military, they were often referred to as the Golden Couple. Chapter 418, Selfish Backstabbers. I'll give it to you if it's what you want, but you're nothing more than a puppet for the Morrison family. If I give you the Eldorian scroll fragment, it'll only end up in some other person's hands, answered Caspian. Jin could tell that Caspian wasn't joking with her, and what he said was true. She had no use for the Eldorian scroll fragment even if he gave it to her. But most of all, Jin was happy that Caspian would willingly give up something so precious to her. Jin finally smiled like a beautiful blooming flower. She realized that she still held a spot in Caspian's heart. Caspian sighed and continued, If you really want it, you can have it. Everyone was flabbergasted by the fact that Caspian was willing to give up the Eldorian scroll fragment. Caspian had, in fact, made many promises to Jin back then. He was a young man in love, and he wasn't experienced enough to think of the consequences of his actions. Regardless, he had still hurt Jin's feelings. He still owed her one. Caspian! Mr. Lynch! Sylvia and the rest of Caspian's men began to panic. It would be a shame if Caspian were to let go of the Eldorian scroll fragment just like that. Noticing Jin's reluctance, Ginger called out to her. Ms. Morrison, what's wrong? Ginger didn't know about what happened between Jin and Caspian back then. Her only thought was to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment and return home to bountiful rewards. The Morrison family members were looking at Jin with anticipation, while Gilbert's expression twisted with despair. He had gone through so much just for a chance to acquire the Eldorian scroll fragment, and now, Caspian was about to give it up without a fight. I don't want it. All I want is you. Jin's answer was beyond everyone's wildest expectations. She had actually chosen to not accept Caspian's gift of the Eldorian scroll fragment. Jin looked up at Caspian with affection. She was willing to give up everything in her life just to be with him. What could some scroll fragments compare to having him by her side? Everyone was shocked beyond relief, as they wondered if Jin was serious about declining his offer. Sylvia laughed and commented, That's Caspian for ya! He's too charming for his own good. She had also garnered affection for Caspian after working by his side for so many years, but she knew that she wasn't worthy enough to be with him. Sylvia had always been jealous of Willow for being able to become his wife. The Morrison family members' expressions turned sour as they wondered if Jin had gone. Insane to be throwing away such an opportunity. They couldn't just go back empty-handed without a proper excuse. Why are you so stubborn, Jin? You should know that it's impossible for anything to happen between the two of us. Willow is my wife, and she's also the one and only in my heart, explained Caspian. Caspian had wanted to give the Eldorian scroll fragment to Jin, so that they would no longer owe each other anything. He could also feel better about his past with Jin. But Jin had unexpectedly rejected his offer. Jin shook her head and replied, I don't care! So what if you're married? I've already decided that you would be mine long ago. I don't want the Eldorian scroll fragment. I'd rather you still have me on your mind. She knew that accepting the Eldorian scroll fragment now meant that she would not be seeing him ever again. Caspian was in disbelief as he recalled the number of men who died just for a chance to obtain this treasure. It was a treasure that was worthless only to the one woman standing before him. Fuck you all. If you're not taking it, then don't mind if I do. A voice suddenly rang out as someone swept past Caspian. By the time Caspian could react, He realized that the Eldorian scroll fragment was no longer in his hands. Fabian excitedly declared, "Ha ha ha! The Eldorian scroll fragment is finally in my hands." He had concealed his presence while carefully observing Jin and Caspian's conversation for a chance to strike in order to snatch the scroll fragment away. Caspian remained calm even after Fabian had snatched the Eldorian scroll fragment away. "Fabian, give it to me, now!" shouted Gilbert. Fabian turned around and smiled at Gilbert. "Why should I give it to you? Only a fool would hand over the Eldorian scroll fragment after they had risked their life to acquire it." Gilbert was stunned. What? What are you trying to do, Fabian? "The Eldorian scroll fragment is mine. Once I learn its secrets, I'll become the strongest," declared Fabian. He would no longer have to obey Gilbert's every whim once he became powerful. He wasn't so stupid as to give the treasure away to Gilbert. "What are you trying to do, Fabian? Aren't you going to be grateful to someone who taught you everything you know?" scolded Gilbert. You've just been treating me as cannon fodder the entire time. Now that the Eldorian scroll fragment is mine, no one will be taking it away from me," replied Fabian. All he needed to do now was to escape. One day, he would return as a fighter more powerful than anyone else. Gilbert clenched his teeth with anger. "You bastard!" He never expected Fabian to have such ambitions. Caspian applauded the show. "Wonderful. This is truly wonderful. I can't believe just how selfish everyone in Shadowgate is. Ha ha ha. What can you do now, Caspian?" "Nothing. The Eldorian scroll fragment is now mine," replied Fabian. Fabian was about to escape from the tomb. "Are you sure?" asked Caspian. The next moment, a dagger was plunged into Fabian's back. He turned around to find Charles literally backstabbing him. "You?" Charles laughed at him. "Ha ha ha, you were too careless." Charles had also been patiently waiting for a chance to strike, and he managed to catch on to this fleeting opportunity. Fabian still wanted to say something, but it was too late. Charles stabbed him in the back a few more times. Fabian's wounds opened up, and blood flowed out of his body without pause. He began to lose consciousness as he succumbed to his wounds. Fabian had endured countless humiliations ever since he was adopted by the Stewart family. He had always wanted to make a name for himself, and he had finally managed to secure the Eldorian scroll fragment. However, everything disappeared in an instant. Fabian collapsed onto the ground with a thud. Charles continued to mock Fabian even after he died. "If only you had learned about loyalty." Gilbert looked at Charles with a smile. "Well done. Now give me the goods." Charles obediently rushed toward Gilbert without a single moment of hesitation. Gilbert received the Eldorian scroll fragment and smiled. "You've done well, Charles. I'll put in a good word for you once we return to Shadowgate HQ. My only wish is for Mr. Burton to kill Caspian," replied Charles. Charles then turned to Caspian and shouted, "I'll never forgive you for killing my family, Caspian. I'll have my revenge." He would still be living a leisurely life if not for Caspian. Charles believed that the leader of Shadowgate would be able to kill Caspian easily. He had been enduring great humiliation within Shadowgate and continuing to live only to enact his revenge. He couldn't wait for Caspian to be defeated so that he could finally unleash his hatred on him. Chapter 419, Tens of Thousands of Troops. Caspian shook his head at Charles. "Wonderful. That's really funny." Charles frowned and asked, "What's so funny?" Caspian sighed and answered, "I always thought that you were a smart man. I never knew that you'd be so stupid to not even realize that you're about to die." Charles smiled back at him. "Enough nonsense, Caspian. Do you really think I'll believe you?" The next moment, Charles suddenly felt immense pain coming from his abdomen. He looked down to find a dagger pierced through his body. It was from none other than Gilbert. "Mr. Shane?" "Why?" asked the dumbfounded Charles. He had risked his life to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment for Gilbert, only to be backstabbed in the very next moment. Caspian's right, you know. You're really stupid. The Eldorian scroll is a sacred treasure that countless men have dreamed of acquiring. And now that I have it, I can even become king. So, do you really think I'll be handing the scroll fragment back to Shadowgate? Of course not. And to do that, I'll have to silence you," explained Gilbert. Charles realized that Gilbert had been keeping him around for the same purpose as Fabian, to serve as mere fodder. He also realized that Fabian was right about Gilbert only keeping them around like pets to serve him. Now that he no longer had any value to Gilbert, Gilbert no longer had any reason to keep him around. Even Fabian had wanted to acquire the Eldorian scroll fragment for his own ambitions. It was only natural that Gilbert had plans of his own with the scroll fragment. He would seek to unlock the scroll fragment's secrets and improve himself to the point of even beyond Supreme Grandmasters before, challenging Elijah for his throne as the leader of Shadowgate. Charles never expected to be killed by Gilbert of all people. "You're such an evil man, Mr. Shane. It's your own fault for being so stupid," replied Gilbert as he pulled out the dagger. Blood gushed out of Charles' body like a fountain as he desperately tried to cover up his wounds. His face was filled with despair and regret for believing in Gilbert. Everything Charles had done was for naught. Caspian was right on the mark that he was stupid. Both Charles and Fabian had been mere tools to Gilbert, but Charles's realization arrived too late. He soon collapsed to the ground and would never move again. Caspian shook his head at the sight of Charles joining Fabian in death. The two of them would have met their end sooner or later, either way. Caspian sighed and asked, "Can't believe you'd even kill your own allies. Is it really worth it to betray them just to get your hands on the Eldorian scroll fragment? Save your breath, Caspian. Everyone in Shadowgate is selfish. We're evil folks who gathered together to achieve our own goals. Who knows if Mr. Burton himself would simply decide to kill us off if he feels like it so that we won't go against him. The weak should fear the strong, and only the strong get to decide who lives," explained Gilbert. Seeing as he was able to rise through the ranks and become the 10th Elder, he had long seen the truth. Shadowgate was a gathering of very cruel individuals. Those who had survived long enough to be given titles were ruthless and selfish to begin with. They had to become stronger than anyone else so that they no longer had to serve someone else. Gilbert stared at Caspian and declared, "Once I've improved myself after unlocking the Eldorian scroll fragment's secrets, I'll be back to kill you first." Both of them held a grudge against each other. Gilbert had endured being humiliated by Caspian again and again. Caspian looked at Gilbert and taunted him, "Don't tell me you really think that acquiring the Eldorian scroll fragment would be so easy." "What do you mean, Caspian?" Gilbert's excitement died down as he realized that something was wrong. Caspian smiled. "Have a look for yourself." Gilbert hurriedly opened the Eldorian scroll fragment and was dumbfounded when he saw its contents. There was only a single word written on the scroll, and it read, "Useless." Gilbert coughed out a mouthful of blood from shock. "Caspian, you bastard, you tricked me again," scolded Gilbert. Caspian remained calm the entire time as he had already anticipated Fabian's actions from the start. The moment Fabian lunged at him to snatch the scroll, Caspian had already switched it out with a fake one. "I'll tear you apart with my own hands, Caspian," declared Gilbert. He was enraged after being tricked by Caspian. However, his anger turned into confusion as he realized Caspian remained calm and collected. He didn't dare to act rashly just yet. Suddenly, the entire tomb began to shake with a loud rumble. "This is bad. It's going to collapse," shouted Xandros. The tomb was rigged to collapse on itself after the coffin was opened. The entire tomb began to collapse with stones falling off what used to be the ceiling. "Run! Get away from here! Get out of here now, or it's going to be too late!" Everyone started screaming as they ran for their lives. Horace was the first to react to the situation. He rounded up the remaining people of the TMAA and brought them out of the tomb. They no longer had any reason to stay now that the head elder of the TMAA was dead, and they only had 400 of them left. Gilbert gritted his teeth and ordered his men to leave. "Get out of here!" He concluded that the mission to retrieve the Eldorian scroll fragment had failed after Caspian had thwarted their plans again and again. Gilbert began his mission with confidence that he would return victorious. He never would have guessed that he would end up going back with nothing to show other than losing a majority of Shadowgate's forces. Caspian watched everyone escape the tomb with intrigue. He knew that Gilbert would eventually come back to cause more trouble for him after he returned to safety. He wasn't worried, however, as he had already assigned John to be stationed outside Mount Evercloud with tens of thousands of troops. It would be difficult for Gilbert and his men to make it out of here alive. Caspian then looked at Jin, who was still standing right beside him. "Why aren't you leaving?" Jin smiled and replied, "I'm waiting for you." Her reply was simple, but it caused a lot of complications for Caspian. "Miss Morrison, we should get going. We're gonna get buried here if we stay any longer," shouted Ginger. Ginger didn't want to die just like this. The falling rocks gradually turned into bigger boulders. Jin, however, still had no intention of leaving. She wore a sweet smile on her beautiful face. She didn't intend to leave so long as Caspian still remained by her side. Ginger was about to lose her mind as Jin had completely turned into a different person ever since she met up with Caspian. Jin used to be a capable leader who never showed any sign of weaknesses. Now, she had been reduced to a mere young lady with a massive crush on Caspian. Ginger decided that she would have to tell the head of the Morrison family about everything wrong with Jin. Caspian was left with no other choice as he realized that Jin wouldn't leave without him. "Let's go." Caspian soon brought everyone out of the tomb. Even the entire valley itself was trembling. The wild beasts were startled and ran to safety as trees began to collapse onto the floor. The scene very much resembled the end of the world. Xandros sighed and explained, "We have to go. This place isn't safe." He couldn't help but feel sad seeing that the tomb of his ancestors was about to be destroyed. Meanwhile, the entirety of Mount Evercloud was shaking violently. John remained at his post, guarding the tomb's entrance and waiting for Caspian to appear. "Prepare to capture all of the people from Shadowgate and the TMAA, ordered John. "Yes, sir." The 10,000 soldiers brought out their weapons and aimed right at the tomb's entrance. Chapter 420, a legend. "Ha ha ha, I made it out alive." A loud rumble echoed throughout the mountain as the tomb fully collapsed. Horace ran out to safety along with hundreds of people from the TMAA. "We made it out. We're still alive. We're lucky." The remaining members of the TMAA let out a long sigh of relief after surviving the hardest mission of their lives. They had arrived in tens of thousands, yet all that remained of them now was 2,000. They couldn't help but shiver as they thought about the tragic events that unfolded within the tomb. "Listen up, my brothers. We need to get back to the TMAA HQ and report all of this to the chairman. We need to have the chairman help us kill Caspian and avenge the head elder," declared Horace. "Kill him! Caspian must die." The people of the TMAA responded with similar fervor as they also hated Caspian. A voice suddenly sounded out of nowhere. "Kill Caspian, you say? You can think about it if you manage to get out of here alive." The crowd froze up on the spot. Horace took a look around him and realized there were thousands of armed soldiers aiming their weapons at him. What the hell happened? Why was the military here? "Run!" shouted Horace as he moved his legs. The people of the TMAA scattered across all directions at once. "Fire," ordered John. Bullets soon showered upon their targets like rain. It was followed by a burst of wailing sounds as the people of the TMAA collapsed to the ground. They may have been trained fighters, but they couldn't possibly stand a chance against so many armed soldiers at once. They were still unable to figure out why the military was here as the light faded from their eyes. Some started to regret ever crossing paths with Caspian. John laughed with contempt. "Trash like you think you can kill Lord Caspian? That's funny. Caspian was none other than the Diaturanian god of war himself. How could the people of the TMAA even dare to think about desecrating him?" After the initial round of fire had died down, 400 more men made their way out of the tomb. Leading the group was none other than Gilbert. Gilbert's expression sank as he noticed the floor being littered with the people of the TMAA who had escaped before them. Once he looked up from the corpses, Gilbert was left utterly dumbfounded. His entire body began to tremble as his heartbeat skyrocketed. He didn't even wonder where the troops came from as his only thought was about whether or not he had any chance of escaping. "Charge! Make a path for everyone to escape," ordered Gilbert. Hundreds of Shadowgate's members rushed toward the troops with hesitation. Kill them. Only death awaited them if they tried to surrender. They may still have a chance to survive if they fought until the very end. John snorted at the scene. "Know your limits, loser." He was a man of action who never liked wasting time to talk anyway. Another round of gunshots rang out across the mountain, and all of Shadowgate's members were shot dead. Gilbert was enraged as he had lost his only chance to escape. "Fuck! You bastard!" Luckily, he had managed to dodge all of the bullets thanks to his elusive footwork. John then rushed toward Gilbert alone. "About time for me to move a muscle." It had been a very long time since he last fought someone. He was worried that his skills might have gotten rusty now that the South Aridlands was relatively peaceful. John and Gilbert collided with one another in an instant, and a gust of wind exploded from their impact with each other. Both of them were then sent flying backward. John smiled as he realized that his opponent wasn't as weak as he thought. Gilbert, however, was sent rolling on the floor for almost 30 feet. His internal organs were all severely damaged by John's single punch. He had lost his will to continue fighting as his mind became filled with questions. How terrifying! Just who the hell are these people? Suddenly, a cloud of smoke appeared on the ground. Gilbert took the opportunity and escaped. "Kill every single one of them," ordered John. None of the Team AA's men who were still fighting back would live to see another day. Eventually, all 5,000 of the Team AA's men were wiped out. Shadowgate's forces were similarly cleaned up. The last few dozen people finally made it out of the tomb with Jin at the front. "Ready your weapons," ordered John. All of his troops then aimed their weapons at Jin and her men. The Morrison family members were terrified. Ginger walked forward and angrily shouted, "Open your fucking eyes! We're part of the Morrison family from Dord City." The Morrison family of Dord City was a significant and powerful family within the country that may even have relations with the top echelons of Diatoran. Even a highly ranked military officer would pay their respects to the Morrisons. John, however, replied with nothing but contempt. "The Morrison family? What the hell is that?" He was a senior general who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. The Morrison family was truly nothing before him. Ginger stomped her feet with anger. Damn it! She couldn't believe that John wasn't afraid of her even after she announced her affiliation. The Morrison family had never witnessed such disrespectful behavior. "Shut your mouth!" shouted Jin. Jin realized that the troops standing before her were related to Caspian. She realized that Caspian's rank in the military must have risen over the years. She was very curious as to what was his current position in the army. Another 100 men made it out of the tomb. Caspian took a deep breath and said, "I really prefer the air out here." Thousands of soldiers immediately stood in attention and saluted Caspian. "Lord Caspian!" They were all thrilled to see their role model safe and sound. Caspian was a legendary figure within the military, known as the Diaturanian god of war. For many of the soldiers, it was their first time seeing Caspian. They couldn't contain their excitement. Jin was dumbfounded as she watched the scene unfold before her. She could only wonder when the military had installed a new rank called Lord, as she had never heard of such a title before. They were just simple soldiers when she served in the army alongside Caspian back then. Meanwhile, Caspian was assigned as the squad leader for his performance. After Jin was discharged, she no longer knew about what happened within the military. She had tried to ask plenty of people throughout the years, but she would always be refused an answer because of confidentiality within the military. Eventually, Jin no longer knew about Caspian's rank, nor did she know about his true strength. She didn't understand what the soldiers meant by addressing Caspian as Lord Caspian, but she could tell that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Jin had always wondered why Caspian would willingly become a metrolocal son-in-law to the stewards. She finally realized that he had been hiding his identity all along. Jin's chest heaved up and down as she became nervous. Her gaze at Caspian had also become more affectionate. She made a promise to herself that she would snatch Caspian away from Willow no matter what. Jin had already decided that Caspian would be the one and only man she would spend her life with. She had fantasized countless times about a scenario where she would sacrifice everything she had, just to be together with Caspian. She was also willing to bring the scenario to reality by any means necessary.